What happens when two of the most outspoken women in media sit down for what was supposed to be a light-hearted chat, only for it to spiral into one of the most jaw-dropping moments in daytime television history? The tension in the studio was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and what started as polite conversation quickly turned into a verbal showdown that left everyone in the audience completely stunned. Before we get into exactly what was said that made Meghan Markle storm off the set, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us whose side you're on in this unbelievable dispute. Because trust me, you're going to have opinions about this one. The atmosphere in the View studio that morning felt different from the moment Meghan walked onto the set. She was wearing a cream-colored blazer with tailored trousers. Her signature California casual elegance on full display, but there was something guarded in her expression. The audience applauded as she took her seat at the table, settling in between Whoopi Goldberg and Sunny Hostin, while Joy Behar sat across from her with that familiar, knowing smile that has become her trademark over decades on television. Whoopi started things off warmly, welcoming Meghan and mentioning her latest philanthropic projects. Meghan smiled graciously, thanking the hosts for having her and expressing how much she'd been looking forward to the conversation. For the first few minutes, everything seemed pleasant enough. They discussed her work with various charities, her focus on women's empowerment, and her life in California. Meghan spoke eloquently about finding her voice and using her platform for causes she believed in. The other hosts nodded along, asking supportive questions and creating what seemed like a safe space for open dialogue. But then, Joy leaned forward. And anyone who watches The View regularly knows that when Joy Behar leans forward with that particular glint in her eye, she's about to say something provocative. She tilted her head slightly and said, "So Meghan, I have to ask, and I think a lot of people are wondering this. You've spoken a lot about wanting privacy, about protecting your family from the spotlight, about the intrusion of the media. But at the same time, you've done interviews, podcasts, documentaries, and now you're here with us. Help us understand that, because to a lot of people, it seems like you want it both ways." The studio went quiet. Meghan's smile tightened just a fraction, and you could see her processing how to respond. She took a breath and said, "I think there's a difference between choosing when and how you share your story versus having your narrative constantly controlled and manipulated by people who don't know you. What my husband and I have objected to isn't being in the public eye. It's the invasion, the lies, the targeting of our family, especially when it involves our children. We're not asking to never be seen, we're asking for basic respect and accuracy." Joy nodded slowly but didn't back down. She replied, "Okay, I hear that, but when you sit down for a primetime interview that's watched by millions of people, or when you release a documentary series about your life, isn't that also controlling the narrative? Isn't that also putting yourself very much in the public eye? I'm just trying to understand where the line is, because from where I'm sitting, it seems like the line moves depending on what's convenient." Sunny jumped in quickly, saying, "Joy, I think what Meghan is saying is that there's a difference between sharing your truth and having lies printed about you. She's talking about tabloids making things up, not about doing legitimate press." But Joy wasn't letting it go. She turned back to Meghan and said, "But who decides what's legitimate? You've criticized certain outlets for years, but then you work with other outlets that are very friendly to you. Doesn't that seem selective?" Meghan's jaw tightened, and she said, "Joy, I think you're misunderstanding the fundamental issue here. When a publication prints that I made my sister-in-law cry when the opposite happened, that's not a difference of opinion, that's a lie. When they claim I'm difficult to work with, and former staff come forward to dispute that, but those corrections never get the same headlines, that's not about being selective, that's about accuracy. I've never said I want to be completely private. I've said I want to be treated fairly." Joy raised her eyebrows and said, "Okay, but here's what I don't get. You married into arguably the most famous family in the world. Did you really not know what you were signing up for? Because it seems like there was maybe some naivety there about what that life would actually be like. The British press has always been brutal to royal women. This isn't something new. Diana dealt with it, Camilla dealt with it, Kate deals with it. So why should your experience be different?" The comparison to other royal women clearly struck a nerve. Meghan leaned forward and her voice became firmer as she said, "First of all, the difference in how the British media has covered Kate versus how they've covered me has been documented extensively. There are literally articles where they praise her for doing something and then criticize me for doing the exact same thing. That's not about being a royal. That's about something else entirely, and I think we both know what that is. And secondly, yes, I knew there would be interest. I knew there would be scrutiny. But what I didn't anticipate was the cruelty. I didn't anticipate the racism. I didn't anticipate that the institution itself would participate in undermining me rather than protecting me. Joy sat back and said, "See, this is where you lose me. You talk about racism, and I'm sure there were awful comments from terrible people online. But are you saying the entire British media is racist? Are you saying everyone who has criticized you is racist? Because that's a very serious accusation. And it also becomes a way to dismiss any legitimate criticism by just calling it racism." Meghan's eyes flashed and she said, "Joy, I have never said that everyone who criticizes me is racist. What I have said is that there has been a racial element to how I've been covered. That is undeniable if you actually look at the evidence. I'm not pulling the race card, as people love to say. I'm pointing out documented patterns of coverage. And the fact that you're suggesting I'm using racism as a shield against legitimate criticism is exactly the kind of gaslighting that I've been talking about." The word gaslighting seemed to land like a bomb. Joy's expression hardened, and she said, "Gaslighting? I'm asking you questions, Meghan. That's what we do here. We have conversations, we push back, we don't just nod along with everything our guests say. If that's gaslighting to you, then maybe you're not used to being challenged." Whoopi tried to intervene, saying, "Okay, ladies, let's take a breath here. I think we're all just trying to have an honest conversation." But Meghan was clearly upset now. She said, "An honest conversation would involve actually listening to what I'm saying instead of twisting my words. I came here in good faith, thinking we could have a nuanced discussion. But instead, I'm being interrogated and having my experiences dismissed." Joy shot back, "You're not being interrogated, you're being interviewed. There's a difference. And if you can't handle someone asking you direct questions without accusing them of attacking you, then maybe you need to ask yourself why that is. You've made a career out of telling your story, but apparently only on your terms. Only when people ask you softball questions and tell you how brave you are." Meghan stood up abruptly, and the audience gasped. She said, "You know what, Joy? You clearly had your mind made up about me before I even walked in here. This isn't journalism. This is a hit job. And I don't have to sit here and be disrespected like this." Joy remained seated but raised her voice slightly, saying, "Oh, come on. Don't be so dramatic. You came on a talk show where we're known for having spirited debates. If you can't take the heat, I don't know what to tell you." Meghan grabbed her microphone pack and started to remove it, her hands shaking slightly as she fumbled with a wire. Sunny reached out and put a hand on her arm, saying, "Meghan, please, let's just take a moment here. Nobody's trying to attack you." But Meghan shook her head and said, "No, I'm done. I've sat through enough hostile interviews to know what this is, and I'm not doing it anymore." Joy stood up now, too, her voice rising as she said, "Hostile? You think this is hostile? Meghan, I've interviewed dictators, war criminals, corrupt politicians. I've asked them hard questions, and they managed to sit there and answer them. You're upset because I asked you to explain contradictions in your public statements. If that's too much for you, then I honestly don't know how you expect to be taken seriously as someone who wants to be an advocate and a public figure." Meghan turned to face Joy directly and said, "There's a difference between hard questions and loaded questions designed to make me look like a hypocrite. Every question you've asked has been framed in the most negative possible way. You're not trying to understand my perspective. You're trying to catch me out to get a soundbite that makes me look bad. And I'm not playing that game anymore." Joy crossed her arms and said, "I'm asking you the questions that people actually want answered. If they seem hard, maybe it's because there aren't easy answers. You can't spend years criticizing the media and then expect the media to just give you a pass. That's not how this works. You want to be seen as credible? Then answer the questions without melting down." The phrase melting down clearly infuriated Meghan. She stepped closer to the table and said, "I am not melting down. I am setting a boundary. There is a difference between robust debate and someone who is clearly biased against me trying to tear me down under the guise of journalism. You've made your opinion of me very clear. Joy, you think I'm entitled, you think I'm playing the victim. You think I married into the royal family and then had the audacity to complain when it wasn't a fairy tale. Am I getting that right? Joy didn't flinch. She said, "You know what? Since you asked, I'll be honest. I think you're an intelligent, accomplished woman who made choices and now wants to be seen only as a victim of those choices rather than taking any responsibility for how things played out. I think you knew exactly what marrying into that family would mean, and when it got hard, instead of toughing it out, like literally every other person who has married into that family, you left and then spent years publicly airing grievances. Do I think you faced racism? Probably. Do I think that's the whole story? No, I don't. And I think a lot of people feel the same way, but are afraid to say it because they'll be accused of being racist or insensitive." The audience was completely silent now. Stunned by how confrontational this had become, Meghan's face was flushed, and she said, "So there it is. You've decided that my lived experience, my truth, the racism I endured, the lack of support I received, the impact it had on my mental health to the point where I had suicidal thoughts. You've decided all of that is just me being difficult and not wanting to tough it out. Do you have any idea how dangerous that narrative is? Do you understand what you're doing right now by suggesting that someone who speaks up about mistreatment is just complaining?" Joy's voice softened slightly, but remained firm as she said, "Meghan, I'm not diminishing your mental health struggles. If you were in that much pain, I'm glad you got out and I'm glad you got help. But you can't expect everyone to just accept your version of events without question. You've made very serious allegations about that family, about racism within the institution, about being unsupported. But you've been vague about specifics. You won't name names, you won't provide concrete examples, but you want everyone to just believe you and not ask follow-up questions. That's not reasonable," Meghan shot back. "I've been vague because naming specific people would make things worse, and because I still have some loyalty, believe it or not, to a family that showed me none, and I have provided examples. I've talked about the conversations about my son's skin color. I've talked about having my passport taken away. I've talked about being told I couldn't get help when I was suicidal. Those are specific. But every time one provides specifics, people like you move the goalposts and say, it's not enough, or I'm exaggerating, or I'm lying." Joy shook her head and said, "The conversation about skin color? We only have your word for that, and you won't say who said it, which makes it impossible to verify or get the other side. That's my point. You're making claims that can't be proven or disproven because you won't provide enough information. And then you get upset when people are skeptical." Meghan's voice was shaking now with emotion as she said, "I'm protecting people who don't deserve my protection. Joy, that's what I'm doing. I could name names. I could provide text messages and emails and recordings. I could burn it all down. But I haven't because, unlike what you seem to think of me, I'm not vindictive. I'm not trying to destroy anyone. I just wanted to tell my story so that other people who are suffering in silence know they're not alone," Joy replied. "Okay, but you have to understand how that sounds to people. You say you could provide proof, but you won't. You say you're protecting people who hurt you. That's your choice, but then you can't be surprised when people question your account. And this whole thing about telling your story so others don't feel alone? That's a very convenient frame for what is essentially airing very personal family drama on a global stage." Whoopi tried again to interject, saying, "Joy, maybe we should move on to another topic." But Meghan cut her off and said, "No, I want to address this. Joy, you keep talking about choices, about responsibility. Let me ask you something. If you were in a situation where you felt unsupported, unprotected, where you felt like your mental health was suffering to the point of crisis, where you felt like staying might literally kill you, what would you do? Would you just tough it out because that's what people expect? Or would you leave and try to build a better life?" Joy answered without hesitation, "I would leave, absolutely. But here's the thing. I wouldn't then spend the next several years doing interviews about it. I wouldn't write books about it. I wouldn't do documentaries about it. I would leave, I would heal privately, and I would move on with my life." That's the part that people struggle with. It seems less like you left to find peace and more like you left to build a brand around having left. Meghan looked like she'd been slapped. She said quietly, "That is so unfair. You have no idea what it's like to have lies told about you constantly, to watch your reputation be destroyed by people with an agenda, to see your family weaponized against you in the press. I didn't tell my story to build a brand. I told it Because if I didn't, the only narrative out there would be the one being pushed by people who want to paint me as a villain. I was defending myself. Joy spread her hands and said, "But at what cost? You've essentially made it impossible to ever repair those relationships. You've said things publicly that can't be unsaid. And now you're in this position where you're permanently at odds with your husband's family. Your father isn't speaking to you. Your sister isn't speaking to you. And yes, maybe all of those people wronged you in various ways. But at some point, don't you have to ask yourself if the way you've handled it has been worth it? Don't you have to wonder if maybe there was a better way?" Meghan's eyes were glistening now, and she said, "You think I don't ask myself that every single day? You think I don't lie awake at night wondering if I made the right choices? But I did what I had to do to survive, Joy, and I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm not going to apologize for choosing my mental health, for choosing my children, for choosing a life where I'm not being slowly destroyed by an institution that saw me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be supported." Joy's expression softened, just slightly as she said, "Look, I'm sure parts of your experience were genuinely awful. I'm not saying you made everything up, or that you're lying, but I also think you're smart enough to know that going public the way you have, with the level of detail you've provided, with the accusations you've made, that was always going to be seen as an attack on that family. You can frame it as defending yourself all you want, but the reality is, you've damaged people's reputations, you've caused rifts that may never heal, and you've done it all very publicly. So forgive me if I think there's more to this story than just a woman who wanted to be left alone." Meghan wiped at her eyes quickly, composing herself before speaking. She said, "You want to talk about strategy? Let's talk about strategy. When I was silent, when I didn't defend myself, when I followed all the rules and kept quiet like I was supposed to, what happened? I was destroyed in the press anyway. They called me demanding, difficult, a bully. They said I made people cry, that I drove staff away, that I was controlling my husband. None of it was true, but it didn't matter because I wasn't allowed to speak. So tell me, Joy, what exactly was I supposed to do? Just let them keep lying. Just let my reputation be shredded while I smiled and waved." Joy sat back down slowly and said, "I'm not saying you should have stayed silent forever, but there's a middle ground between saying nothing and doing a primetime special, watched by tens of millions of people, where you make explosive claims about racism and neglect. There's a way to set the record straight without burning every bridge. You could have released a statement. You could have done a measured interview with one outlet. You could have been strategic about it in a way that didn't feel like a nuclear option." Meghan shook her head emphatically and said, "A statement. Joy, they ignored my statements. They twisted them, they took sentences out of context, they made me look worse. The only way to make sure my actual words were heard was to sit down and tell the whole story in my own voice, where it couldn't be edited or manipulated. And as for burning bridges, those bridges were already burned. They were burned by family members who spoke to the press about me, who cooperated with biographies designed to make me look bad, who stood by while I was eviscerated publicly and did nothing to defend me." Joy leaned forward again and said, "Okay, let's talk about your family then, because it's not just his family you're estranged from. Your own father has done interviews saying you've cut him off. Your half-sister has been very vocal about feeling abandoned by you. Are they all lying too? Are all of these people across two separate families just making things up? Or is there possibly a pattern here where you cut people off when they don't do exactly what you want?" Meghan's voice rose sharply as she said, "My father sold stories about me to tabloids, Joy. He staged photographs for money. He lied about me repeatedly in the press. My half-sister, who I barely know and haven't had a relationship with in years, has made a career out of attacking me publicly. So yes, I cut them off because they proved over and over again that they couldn't be trusted. That's not me being difficult. That's me protecting myself and my family from people who have shown they will exploit our relationship for personal gain." Joy countered quickly. "That's my point exactly. Everyone who has a problem with you, you have an explanation for why they're wrong and you're right. Your dad betrayed you, your sister is jealous, his family is racist and At what point do you consider that maybe you're the common denominator here? Maybe the way you handle relationships, the way you handle conflict, maybe that's part of the problem." The accusation hung in the air like a grenade. Meghan stared at Joy for a long moment before saying, "That is incredibly insulting. You're essentially saying that if multiple people have issues with me, it must be my fault. But that logic falls apart when you consider power dynamics. When you're dealing with an institution like the monarchy, when you're dealing with a media environment that was hostile to me from day one, when you're dealing with family members who saw an opportunity to profit off of attacking me, the common denominator isn't me being difficult. The common denominator is that I was an easy target. Joy said, and hear me out here, maybe you're someone who doesn't handle criticism well, who expects everyone around them to fall in line with their narrative, and who cuts people off ruthlessly when they don't. I'm not saying you're a bad person, Meghan. I'm saying that maybe you have some blind spots about your own behavior and how you come across to people. You've known me for all of 30 minutes, and you're psychoanalyzing me, telling me I have blind spots, suggesting I'm the problem in all of my relationships. Do you do this to every guest, Joy, or just the ones you've already decided you don't like? Joy's voice hardened again as she said, I do this to guests who I think aren't being entirely honest with themselves or with the public. And yes, I decided before you came here that I had questions about your narrative. Because I've watched your interviews, I've heard your story, and parts of it don't add up for me. That doesn't mean I don't like you. It means I'm doing my job. Meghan finally finished removing her microphone and held it in her hand. She said, your job is supposed to be journalism, not character assassination. There's a way to ask tough questions without being dismissive and condescending. But you haven't been interested in my answers. Joy, you've been interested in tearing me down, in confirming your own biases. And I think the audience can see that. I think people watching at home can see that. Joy stood up again and said, you know what I think the audience sees? I think they see someone who talks a lot about authenticity and vulnerability, but can't handle actual pushback. I think they see someone who wants sympathy without accountability. And I think they see someone walking off a set because the conversation got uncomfortable, which kind of proves my point about how you handle things when they don't go your way. Meghan's face flushed red, and she said, I'm walking off because this stopped being a conversation and became an ambush. You're not interested in dialogue, you're interested in a takedown. And I have enough self-respect not to sit here and be your punching bag for ratings. Joy replied sharply, oh, please, don't act like you're above caring about ratings. Everything you've done since leaving has been calculated for maximum attention. The interview, the podcast, the documentary, the book, you know exactly how to play the media game when it benefits you. You just don't like it when the media doesn't play along with your preferred narrative. Sunny stood up now, trying to physically position herself between them as she said, okay, this is getting too heated. Let's all just take a breath. But neither Meghan nor Joy was backing down. Meghan said, I'm not playing a game, Joy. I'm living my life, and yes, I'm telling my story. But that's because if I don't, other people will tell it for me and get it wrong. You can call that calculated if you want, but I call it taking control of my own narrative after years of having it controlled by people with agendas. Joy said, and what's your agenda, Meghan? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like it's to be seen as a victim while also being admired and celebrated. You want people to feel sorry for what you went through, but you also want them to think you're incredibly strong and brave. You want privacy, but you also want a platform. You want to move on, but you keep talking about the past. You can't have it all ways. Meghan's voice dropped to a steely calm as she said, my agenda is to live authentically, to use whatever platform I have for good to protect my family, and to make sure that my children grow up knowing that their mother stood up for herself and for what was right. If that's confusing to you, if that seems contradictory, then maybe you need to examine your own assumptions about what women, especially women of color, are supposed to be. We're supposed to be grateful, right? We're supposed to be quiet. We're supposed to accept mistreatment with grace. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, Joy, but I'm not going to do that. Joy said, oh, now I'm racist too. Is that where we're going with this? Because I'm asking you tough questions, suddenly it's about race. That's exactly what I was talking about earlier. You use these accusations to shut down any criticism. Meghan said icily, I didn't call you racist. But I am saying that your expectations of how I should behave, of what I should tolerate, those expectations might be influenced by biases you're not even aware of. And the fact that you immediately got defensive and accused me of calling you racist when I said nothing of the sort. That's pretty telling. Joy threw up her hands and said, this is ridiculous. I ask you questions. You don't like them, so you accuse me of bias and then walk off. That's not brave, Meghan. That's running away. Meghan picked up her bag from beside her chair and said, "No, Joy. Brave is sitting through years of abuse and still finding the strength to speak your truth. Brave is knowing people like you will pick apart everything you say and doing it anyway because you know other people need to hear it. What's not brave is using your platform to bully someone under the guise of tough journalism. You should be ashamed of yourself." And with that, Meghan turned and walked toward the exit. The cameras followed her as she moved across the studio floor, her heels clicking loudly in the stunned silence. Joy called after her, "Meghan, come on, don't be ridiculous." But Meghan didn't turn around. She reached the door, pushed it open, and walked through it without looking back. The moment the door closed behind her, the studio erupted. The audience began talking all at once, some people gasping, others murmuring to their neighbors. Joy stood at the table looking frustrated, shaking her head as Whoopi said something to her quietly. Sunny had her hand over her mouth, clearly shocked by how the interview had imploded. So there you have it. One of the most explosive interviews in recent television history, ending with a guest walking off the set after a heated exchange about truth and accountability.